A wealthy man came home early and heard sounds from the kitchen late at night. He found his shy maid hiding in the pantry, desperately eating leftover scraps from dinner. When he discovered why she was hiding, his heart shattered and he did something incredible. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 11 as Richard Morrison walked through his mansion's front door, exhausted from a business dinner that had run longer than expected. The house stood silent and dark except for a dim light coming from the kitchen, unusual because his housekeeper should have finished her duties hours ago and retired to her quarters. Richard loosened his tie and walked quietly toward the light, assuming Maria had simply forgotten to turn it off, but as he approached, he heard sounds that made him pause, the scrape of a fork against a plate, quick movements like someone trying to be silent, and what sounded like suppressed crying. His curiosity turned to concern as he pushed open the kitchen door and discovered a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life and change everything he thought he knew about the woman who'd been working in his home for 6 months. Maria Santos crouched in the walk-in pantry, partially hidden behind shelves of dry goods, eating leftovers from the dinner Richard's chef had prepared that evening. But she wasn't eating normally. She was eating desperately, quickly, like someone starving, tears streaming down her face as she scraped every bit of food from the containers with shaking hands. When she saw Richard standing in the doorway, her face transformed into absolute terror. The container slipped from her hands and crashed to the floor, marinara sauce spreading across the tiles like accusation. She dropped to her knees immediately, apologizing in broken English mixed with Spanish, her voice panicked. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Morrison. Please don't fire me. I was so hungry. I'm so sorry. I'll clean it up. Please, I need this job." Richard stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Maria was thin. He'd noticed that before, but assumed it was natural. But now he saw gauntness that spoke of genuine malnourishment, saw how her uniform hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost significant weight, saw desperation in her eyes that went beyond fear of losing employment. His voice came out gentle despite his shock. "Maria, please stand up. You're not in trouble. I just want to understand what's happening. Why are you hiding and eating leftovers? Don't you eat during the day?" Maria remained on her knees, still terrified, her words tumbling out between sobs. She explained through tears how she sent almost her entire paycheck back to Honduras, where her 3 children lived with her mother. Her husband had been killed 2 years ago working construction, leaving her alone to support her family. She'd come to America on a work visa to earn money to feed her children, to pay for her daughter's medical treatments for a heart condition, to keep her family alive. After paying rent for the tiny room she shared with 2 other housekeepers, after sending money home, she had almost nothing left for food. She'd been surviving on 1 small meal a day, whatever cheap rice and beans she could afford, but this week her daughter's medication had cost more than expected, and Maria had sent extra money, leaving her with nothing. She hadn't eaten in 2 days before tonight's moment of weakness, when hunger overcame her shame and she'd snuck down to eat what would have been thrown away anyway. Richard felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. He'd been paying Maria a salary he'd considered generous for housekeeping work, had never asked about her circumstances, had never looked beyond her quiet efficiency to see the person struggling beneath the surface. He'd walked past her every day, eating his chef-prepared meals, wasting food regularly, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman cleaning his house was starving because she was sacrificing everything to keep her children alive thousands of miles away. The guilt was crushing and immediate, made worse by the realization that Maria's desperation had existed in his home for months while he'd remained comfortably ignorant. Richard's voice was thick with emotion. "Maria, please get up. You're not in trouble. I'm the one who should be apologizing. You should never have to hide to eat. This is your home too while you work here." He helped her to her feet, guided her to the kitchen table, and began pulling food from the refrigerator. He made her a proper plate, heated everything, poured her water and juice, and sat across from her while she ate, this time slowly, still uncertain this wasn't some cruel trick before punishment came. While she ate, Richard asked questions he should have asked months ago. About her children, their ages, their needs, about her living situation, her expenses, her impossible choice between feeding herself and feeding her family. Maria showed him pictures on her worn phone. 3 beautiful children, the oldest only 10, smiling despite circumstances Richard couldn't imagine. Her daughter with the heart condition, brave and small, who needed expensive medication to stay alive. Her mother, elderly and tired, trying to care for 3 grandchildren on nothing while waiting for money transfers that kept them barely surviving. Maria's hands trembled as she spoke about the constant fear that she wouldn't send enough, that her daughter's condition would worsen, that her family would starve because she'd failed them. Richard listened with growing shame and determination, understanding that his comfortable ignorance had contributed to suffering that was happening under his own roof. That night, Richard made immediate decisions. First, he tripled Maria's salary effective immediately, ensuring she could both support her family and feed herself properly. Second, he set up a direct arrangement with his chef to prepare meals specifically for Maria daily, ending forever the possibility of her going hungry in a house full of food. Third, he contacted his lawyer about helping Maria's children immigrate legally, beginning a process that would eventually bring her family to America, where she could care for them directly, instead of sending money across borders. Fourth, he connected Maria's daughter with specialists at a children's hospital, arranging for medical care that would actually treat her condition properly rather than just managing symptoms. But Richard didn't stop with Maria. Her situation had opened his eyes to assumptions he'd made about all his employees, about people whose struggles remained invisible because he'd never bothered to look. He reviewed salaries for everyone on his household staff, increased them substantially, and established an employee assistance fund for emergencies. He started actually talking to the people who worked for him, learning their names, their stories, their challenges, treating them like human beings rather than service providers who appeared and disappeared from his awareness as needed. Maria's transformation over the following months was remarkable. With proper nutrition, her health improved dramatically. With financial stability, the constant anxiety that had been eating her alive began to ease. And when her children finally arrived in America 6 months later, Richard was at the airport with her, watching her reunion with kids she'd been separated from for nearly 2 years. Witnessing joy so pure, it made his earlier ignorance feel even more shameful. He'd set up a proper apartment for Maria and her family, ensured her mother had a visa to come help with the children, and arranged for her daughter to receive the cardiac care that would eventually correct her condition completely. Years later, Maria's oldest daughter graduated from high school with a full scholarship to college, standing on a stage and thanking the employer who'd seen her mother's desperation and responded with humanity rather than judgment. Richard sat in the audience, no longer the man who'd walked past suffering without seeing it, transformed by the moment he'd found his housekeeper hiding in his pantry eating leftovers because she loved her children more than she valued her own survival. He'd learned that wealth meant nothing if it built walls between himself and the humanity of others. That comfort could become a prison of ignorance if you let it, and that sometimes finding someone eating scraps in your kitchen was the universe forcing you to finally see what had been invisible too long.